Hello, everybody. Welcome to this event to mark World Human Rights Day. Lovely to be here. My name's Simon Oldroyd, and I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor here at Montfort University for Sustainability. And I'm delighted that this session will share such a diversity of knowledge and expertise from law, performing arts, business, employment, and skills. And I think it shows how important this subject is to all of us and to our everyday lives. And as many of you are aware, or I hope you're aware, De Montfort University is currently the UK's only higher education institution with the United Nations Academic Impact Sustainable Development Goal hub status, and the only one in the world with responsibility for Sustainable Development Goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. I'm also delighted that only yesterday, in the 2021 People and Planet Sustainable University League, which was published yesterday morning, De Montfort University came in 4th place within that Sustainable University League in the UK, and I'm really pleased and proud to be able to tell colleagues that. The hub status for SDG 16 was awarded to the university following a positive working relationship with the UN's Department of Global Communications. And I'm really delighted to have our friend Omar Hernández, Public Information Officer and Human Rights Expert, joining our event today live from the UN headquarters in New York. As a global hub for SDG 16, it was really important for us to participate in today's World Human Rights Day. And to encourage people to become aware of human rights. SDG 16 calls on us to promote peaceful and inclusive societies, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. And is arguably the SDG with the closest links to human rights. De Montfort University is keen to create impacts for SDG 16 and all other SDGs as part of its commitment to being a UNAI hub. Recently, we held our first SDG 16 hub research and teaching meeting of those academics whose work links directly to SDG 16. And I'm delighted to say that we had over 20 staff involved. We had at least over 20 staff involved in at least one field of impact or one target or indicator for SDG 16. All 4 of our faculties here, all 4 DMU faculties are represented in the group, and there's still an open call for staff to participate if you feel that your research or teaching connects specifically to SDG 16. Furthermore, our staff have been invited to share their work with any of the 17 SDGs, not just SDG 16, but with any of the 17 SDGs, as part of a project to identify and collate activity linked to sustainability and the UN Sustainable Development Goals across the whole of our university, in line with the cross-cutting theme that flows through the new DMU strategy on a page. So sustainability and the Sustainable Development Goals is a cross-cutting theme across our new strategy. And it really is becoming apparent that there's a lot of research and teaching activity related to the SDG agenda, which is going on under the radar or unrecognized, which we could potentially benefit from the opportunities and support that we receive from the United Nations as part of our status as an SDG hub within the UN ECOSOC consultative status. And if you feel that your work impacts on one or more of the 17 SDGs, please do get in touch. If you're a student, these opportunities and other opportunities are also available to you. So please sign up as a DMU SDG advocate, as a student advocate, to find out more. For all of these opportunities that I've mentioned so far, please get in touch with Mark Charlton at the SDG 16 Hub here at DMU, or via the hub email that we place within the chat. So as you can see, hopefully you've seen that there's a huge amount of really vibrant activity going on and loads of opportunities for research, for teaching, for learning, and professional services to be involved with over the coming months as we progress. But today, so this afternoon's session, our focus is on World Human Rights Day. and I'd like to welcome you all and to introduce our first speaker for this event. The event will be hosted by Professor Julia Shaw, but our first speaker is from the United Nations, and it's a great pleasure for me to be able to hand over to Omar Hernández, Public Information Officer at the UNAI and a human rights expert. We've worked closely with Omar in our role as SDG 16 Hub, and I'm really pleased that he's been able to join us so early in the morning from New York. It's about 7:45 in the morning at UN headquarters in New York. So I'm really pleased he's been able to come along and to be with us. Really fantastic welcome to you, Omar, and now a great pleasure to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and greetings from New York City. Indeed, very early in the morning here, but it is a real privilege and honor to address you and to speak on behalf of not only the United Nations Academic Impact, but also on behalf of the United Nations in such a wonderful occasion. It is very timely to speak about human rights, to speak about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and how that declaration, that piece of text actually impacts our daily lives, and how the current circumstances and challenges are actually affecting and having a tremendous impact, a severe impact, on the actual enjoyment and full exercise of fundamental freedoms, liberties, and rights as enshrined in the Universal Declaration itself. When we think about human rights, we must remember that how this whole thing started. And allow me to, with your indulgence, to speak a little bit about my experience with human rights. Before joining UNAI, I worked with a number of UN entities, including the UN Office on Drugs and Crime on Education for Justice initiative. And before that, I used to be an international news analyst for the Venezuelan media, and I used to cover in person the sessions of the Human Rights Council in Geneva and the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, also in Geneva. And during approximately 15 years, I used to teach international human rights law and provided training on human rights law, particularly on human rights mechanisms within the UN system, to civil society organizations, NGOs, lawyers, attorneys, judges, even military and police personnel, in addition to journalists. So I have been dealing and experiencing human rights from various angles and perspectives, from civil society, from academia, from media, and now from the UN side. And it's very clear to me that what was drafted more than 70 years ago is still today more valid than ever before, despite the fact that the notion that we know now about human rights was born in the aftermath of World War II. And of course, the whole rationale behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was precisely to ensure that the negative and devastating consequences from the human perspective that were caused by World War II were not going to be repeated. And to some extent, that has been achieved. And the concept of universality, we can number a number of features and characteristics that are directly aligned with human rights. But I would say probably the most important one is universality, which is in the name of the declaration itself. Because when we say universality, it means that regardless of where you are or who you are, which is the political, economic, legal, social system where you live, you are entitled to the same rights. It doesn't matter your age, it doesn't matter your race, it doesn't matter your ethnicity, it doesn't matter your religion. And actually, now that I mentioned race, the whole notion of human rights, it comes with the idea that there are no races. Actually, there's just one race, human race. So we have to acknowledge that when we think about that, while we are here in the few minutes I'm going to be speaking, there are hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of people who are being deprived of their fundamental rights. While we are here, there are people who are starving. While we are here, there are people who have to leave, have to flee their countries out of fear of persecution, or because of war, or because of natural disasters. While we are here, there are women who are being subjected to violence just for the fact that they are women, what we call gender-based violence. While we are here, there are many minorities who are seeing that they cannot express themselves in their own language, or they cannot express themselves. They cannot show their own culture, or they cannot practice their own religion out of fear. While we are here, there are many people who are suffering from hate speech, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and a number of prejudices. While we are here, there are many people who have been detained just for speaking up against the government, or to express some sort of political opinion. While we are here, there are many people around the world who are expecting their legislators to actually legislate in favor of the human rights and fundamental freedoms. So this is important, that while we are here discussing human rights, we remember those who, despite the fact that they have their rights as agreed by the international human rights law, international public law in general, they are not actually enjoying those rights. And it is not the responsibility of individuals to actually make sure that those rights are actually protected and promoted. It is the responsibility of the states. As per international law, the main responsibility lies precisely on the states in terms of not only promoting and advocating for human rights and protecting those human rights, including by legal remedies, but also to ensure that when it's a human rights potential violations, such violations is properly investigated, and those who are responsible for face the legal consequences of that, and the victims are actually repaired and in a manner that is in a standard, or in accordance with human rights regulations that are prevalent around the world. Also, and I always used to say this to my students and went to civil society activists, I always say that one of the most fundamental responsibilities when we come to human rights, that responsibility lies primarily on the states, is to educate about human rights, is to train about human rights. And there's a very recent explanation for that. Not only it is important for legislators and those in working in the military, in the police, in local governments, to actually know human rights in order to better protect them, but also if the population, if all of us, if we are completely ignorant, oblivious to the fact that there are human rights, how are we going to defend them? How are we going to know where to go when there is a human rights violation? How are we going to know what to do to better protect our own human rights, or to protect the human rights of those who are considered most vulnerable? Women, children, elderly, migrants, refugees, people with disabilities, indigenous people, and a very wide range of groups of people that unfortunately are most vulnerable to have their human rights violated. So in that sense, when we talk about education for human rights, I believe the role of institutions of higher education is absolutely critical, not only because universities are very well placed to provide these education programs and initiatives regarding human rights, because they have the expertise, because they have the knowledge, because they have staff, lecturers, researchers, professors with a very significant and relevant experience dealing with human rights, but also because, of course, the vast majority of the university is composed of students at both of the graduate and graduate levels, including at the doctoral level. So we have all this human potential within the universities, and of course, we cannot forget that universities have a very strong connection with communities, with local governments, with even national governments. We are trying from the UNAI side to narrow the gap between policy making, decision making, and the science and academic based approach to challenges and problems. And I believe universities are not only well placed, but if we consider and we must rethink the social responsibility that lies in universities and colleges around the world, it is critical to acknowledge the fact that despite, again, that the main responsibility lies in states, actually universities are considered a very valuable stakeholder when it comes to promoting and advocating and doing outreach regarding human rights. We are very proud to have the Montfort University in the United Kingdom as our very own SDG hub for Goal 16. As Simon said, probably the goal out of all 17 goals that are part of the 2030 agenda, the one that is most connected with human rights. But if we really see each goal between the 2030 agenda, if we see, for example, starting with the very first, no poverty, when we say that people is entitled to have a dignified life, that's actually a human right in itself. When we review, for example, not only the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but all the international instruments that were derived from the declaration, to mention the very first two, the international covenants on both civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights, the right to be fed, the right to decent house, the right to health, the right to education. These are all things that are being covered by the SDGs. So it's not only the SDG 16, which probably makes a very concrete reference to fundamental freedoms and access to information, and a very wide range of things that are directly connected with human rights as we understand them. But if we see each one of the SDGs and their different targets and indicators, in the end, they are all related to human rights. So the actual achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development will be an achievement of human rights for mankind. And we have to acknowledge the fact that we are almost in 2022, a few weeks from now. So there's only 8 years to actually achieve that agenda, to achieve those 17 goals. And in many corners of the world, particularly in the global south where I come from, in which the vast majority of our members of the UN academic impact are, sadly, in many parts of the world, the advancements, the achievements, the gains that the governments made until pretty much late 2019, we have, unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic. So when we think about, okay, let's do something about this. Let's take this crisis, this global crisis, this global challenge that is, in principle, it used to be considered at the very beginning as a health and sanitary crisis, which it is. But all the devastating consequences that the COVID-19 pandemic has had, we must not rethink human rights. So there's no need to reinvent the wheel, as we say, but we really need to see what new normal are we going to have. We cannot go back to the way we used to be. We cannot go back to the way the world used to be. Now that we have this crisis, we have to see it as an opportunity. And this is not a cliche. This is a fact. This is something that we have again to acknowledge. If we are to thinking how to recover better, what about to have a new normal that is more in alignment with human rights standards? We have to make a more sustainable world. Just recently, in the United Kingdom itself, in Glasgow, we have the COP26, with perhaps an outcome that was less than expected by the international community. But nonetheless, when we speak about climate change, some people might say this is a scientific environmental issue that doesn't have anything to do with human rights, for example. Actually, quite the opposite. We have seen that the consequences, the impact of climate change in the humanitarian field, how many people have died, how many people have been injured, how many people have been displaced, how many people is starving because of the effects of climate change. So this is something that we really need to think, and it circles back to the fact that when we see the 2030 agenda, although we have 17 different goals, each goal is not a silo in itself. All goals are interconnected. All goals are interrelated. So when we think about sustainable development in the end, and this is the final message I would like to convey, when we think about sustainable development and when we think about the SDGs, in the end, we're thinking about human rights. And although, once again, the responsibility primarily lies on states, we ourselves, we have a responsibility because of the fact that we are all global citizens. And the role of universities, the role of colleges, the role of institutional education, including research centers, laboratories, and institutes, is fundamental if we really want to see that the ideals that were enshrined 73 years ago on this day in Paris, that those ideals are actually not so much a text in a dead document, but an actual, tangible, and concrete reality for billions around the world, particularly for those that, while we are here, are not actually enjoying and exercising their human rights and fundamental freedom. And with that, thank you very much once again for the invitation on behalf of the United Nations Academic Impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hernández, for that impassioned and thought-provoking speech that reminds us all of not just the importance of the SDG 16, of which we're obviously delighted to have a second term, as the hub, but also the importance of all the social development goals and the fact that 8 years is not a lot of time to kind of address the challenges that face society. So thank you very, very much for opening the event and presenting your background and all of these various important goals and ideas and suggestions for important work that needs to be done in the human rights arena. Also, thank you to Professor Oldroyd for opening the event and for letting us know that we were awarded 4th place, achieving the award for being, a very sustainable university. So to mark World Human Rights Day, it gives me great pleasure to introduce 5 colleagues who are working on research projects across the university, who are going to discuss their work in the context of human rights with a focus on equality and social justice. These projects also speak to the wider aims of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. As Mr. Hernández made clear, all of the goals are important to us, and particularly SDG 16. Peace, justice, and strong institutions are clearly essential in order to provide a stable environment, a foundation for addressing the multifaceted challenges to communities, to societies, to the environment, as we had demonstrated by the recent COP26, which we were very happy that it was hosted in the UK in Glasgow. So there are many different challenges facing the world today, which of course need complex and multifaceted solutions. So each of today's presentations addresses core aspects of these issues. For example, in relation to sustainability in the environment, instances where respect for human life has been devalued and where the notion of truth has been diluted. These research projects emphasize compassion. They emphasize the need for cooperation to solve local and global problems, to pursue the wider goal of a caring world where no one feels left out, excluded, cast aside, ignored, or indeed treated unjustly. So, driven by the will to look to the future and work together to bring about real change, our academics, my colleagues, and our students at Montfort University are all actively cooperating with external agencies and with other academic institutions. And of course, we're delighted to be able to, as we heard from Mr. Hernández today, we're delighted to have the status as, the only SDG 16 hub in the world and so on. So, the idea is what we're trying to achieve at the university is to dream as big as we can, because we're all concerned to help create a world where those dreams can become a reality. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Funmi Adewoli. She's from the Faculty of Arts, Design and Humanities, and she's going to present her fascinating research on performing arts, equality, social justice, perspectives from the African continent.
Thank you. Thank you. So my short presentation is going to be about, as Professor Julia Shaw said, performing arts, equalities, and social justice in Africa. And I'm looking at it from the point of civil society, at how the arts create an environment in which issues around equality and social justice can be discussed. And I suppose the arts plays this role in every country on the earth, but it has a particular importance in Africa due to its history. And some people think that that concept of civil society actually is unworkable in the context of the continent, that it's a concept that came from the global north and therefore doesn't really work with African society. But there are others that think there has been various articulations of civil society in the history of civil society in Africa. And I go with that view. in the pre-colonial period, there was the idea that civil society was how was expressed in the global north, and that the discussions and the public sphere was located there. And during the colonial period, there was two paradigms. One, that African societies were traditional and represented the past and not what was moving forward, and was outside the discussion of forward-thinking ideas. And then there was another idea that civil society was emerging within African nationalism, within that fight for independence. And as African nations gained independence, the concept of civil society has been really aligned with fights against injustice in government, as well as the development of the continent to work together as a whole, all the nations working together as a whole. So there's been various iterations of what civil society is and can be. But what's interesting and what's unique about Africa is that Africa is a continent of about 55 nations, and they're nations within nations. So within each country, there are various ethnic groups that would have been separate nations before colonialism. And this is one of the challenges the African continent faces, because of the multiple ethnic groups, multiple languages, and different systems of government that existed in pre-colonial times, and how to forge that unity. And that unity and equality and social justice is coming, has been forged mainly through the idea of Pan-Africanism. And Pan-Africanism is a philosophy that centers on African unity and draws on the idea of the communal that exists within African society and common heritages to create new environments for agreement and to shore up political decision. And Pan-Africanism as an ideology has been involved and has been in ideology, a strategy. Some people see it as a strategy. Some people see it more in the political or ideological sense. Some people see it as a cultural force. But it's informed discussions ranging from the first Pan-African congresses that led to independence that took place in Europe in the 1900s, down to the establishment of the African Union, which was in 2000. And the African Union has a focus on civil society. One of the challenges of Africa has been the idea of national identities, the national identities of each country, and the identity of the continent itself, because of the new borders that have that came into play with colonialism, and these borders remain in place in post-colonial times. And as a result, cultural production, the development, and what I mean by that, the publishing of plays, the producing of books, dance productions, theatre productions, film, TV, have played a strong part in creating a culture which I will say belongs to civil society, even though it draws on the heritage of the nation, the older traditions. It is looking forward and creating a space in which we can discuss issues such as the SDGs that we're talking about today. I'm going to talk about three trends very quickly. The first one are the national dance ensembles, which came into being around the 1950s, which displayed the cultural dances of each nation. Now, the national dance ensembles are not the same. They're usually categorized like the folk troupes of Europe, but they had a great political agenda, especially in the 50s. Now, sometimes they're looked more to as entertainment, but then they did amazing things in terms that they challenged the notion of civilization through the concept of ballet. And they were considered on stage when they toured in Europe, for example. Some critics saw them as incongruous. How can you bring these forms of dance, which are related to ritual, which are related to communal life? How can you bring them to stage? And there was no framework to really criticize them as art. Those frameworks are being developed now, but what the National Troupe do was create a cultural forum for that kind of discussion as to what kind of institutional frameworks are now emerging in Africa. And another thing that our national troops did is they gave a visual representation of what equality and unity could be. The next one I'm quickly looking at is theatre and the anti-apartheid movement. And from the 1970s, there was an amazing theatre in South Africa, which still exists today, the Market Theatre, where white members of the Black consciousness movement defied the government working with Black actors, and Black actors were not allowed to be actors. So this whole movement just went against the apartheid system. And in this picture, I have Alpha Fugard with the famous actors John Canny and Winston Sona, and they created some classic plays, one which is called Sizwe Banze is Dead. And that play, I watched it when I was in university in the 80s. It was amazing. Sizwe Banze means the new nation, but he was personified by one person in the play who assumed the identity of a dead man in order to get work. And so that was one of the amazing plays that was produced by the Market Theatre, and they were shown to private audiences in South Africa. And then the actors managed to get out of the country and tour the world. And they were one of the reasons why the world began to see and understand what the apartheid system was. The last artistic trajectory I want to talk about are the political playwrights, and they started to emerge from the 1960s. But the picture of the gentleman here is of Ahmed Yerima, who was born in 1957, and he is of we sometimes call him a second-generation playwright, sometimes a third-generation playwright, but he's written some strong plays criticizing the Nigerian government and the politics around petroleum, which has led to ecological devastation, as well as violence in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. His most famous play, I think, is Hard Ground, which was published in 2005, where he talks about these problems of violence around petroleum and the devastation of of water life and the vegetation. So in conclusion, I just want to say the cultural production in Africa has provides a history of debate of the public sphere. And this is where issues of equality, social justice and peace can be debated and disseminated through institutions like the universities, the political sphere, into civil service. Otherwise, these notions are just notions that come from policymakers and politicians. But with culture, it brings all groups of people from different facets of society, provides them a platform to deal with and discuss and form a perspective on these ideas. And so we have various movements within the arts, some of which I've written on this slide. So for the sustainable goals in Africa, I would say the context of cultural production provides a viable space for them to be treated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Funmi. That was fascinating, and we'll move on to our next speaker, which is actually it's two. It's Professor Jonathan Payne, who's our Professor of Work, Employment and Skills, also Director of the People, Organisations and Work Institute. He's based in Leicester Castle Business School, as is his colleague, Dr. Peter Butler. And they're both going to talk about their exciting research, which takes place locally in Leicester, on the role of the third sector in delivering employability support for vulnerable adults and young people, lessons from local projects within Leicester.
Hi, Jonathan. Can you just unmute yourself, please?
Start again. Okay, sorry about that. Hello, everyone. It's great to have the opportunity to talk with you today on Human Rights Day. I want to talk about some of the research I've been doing with my colleague, Peter Butler. We've been looking at third sector organisations running employability projects for unemployed and vulnerable persons in Leicestershire. We're interested in the choices available to this group and the constraints on those choices. Now, choice matters because, as Nobel Prize winning economist Amartya Sen reminds us, the freedom to make real choices about our lives is central to personal well-being and our right to a decent life, as Omar spoke about earlier. We would argue that the choices available to unemployed and vulnerable persons is severely limited. It's limited by the type of punitive welfare policy we have in the UK, or workfare to give it another name, and by wider labour market realities. So what we're interested in then is whether the third sector, non-profit, charities, community organisations can offer a better alternative. It's right today that we should be talking about the human rights of the unemployed in one of the world's richest economies. Some of you may recall that in 2019, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Philip Alston, produced a very hard-hitting report on the UK. Years of austerity, the rollout of universal credit had inflicted what he called great misery on the poor. Policies he described as callous and mean-spirited. Poverty was, he said, a political choice. Of course, the report was quickly refuted by ministers. But more recently, we've seen the withdrawal of the £20 uplift in universal credit that was brought in during the pandemic. You know, it's tough being unemployed in this country. Compared to Scandinavia, the level of benefits is very low. And this is designed to incentivize claimants to enter a low-wage labour market and often very poor quality jobs most people would rather avoid if they had the choice. It's not just financial pressures, and we all know about food banks. Government and parts of the media present the unemployed as lazy, as scroungers. Being, quote, on benefits is stigmatized, and getting a job, any job, is deemed the morally right thing to do. Of course, such views are challenged. Ken Loach's I, Daniel Blake film is one popular example. But the tragedy is that many of the unemployed still internalize the shame of being unemployed. Matters are not helped when you enter the job centre. We have a punitive approach based on welfare conditionality and tough sanctions. Claimants must demonstrate continual job search or face the suspension of benefits, which can be as long as 26 weeks. The focus is on pushing people into any job as quickly as possible. There is very little support from work coaches to help you find suitable work. A quick meeting, mainly geared towards monitoring job search activity and overseeing sanctions. Some academics even liken this system to the treadwheel used in Victorian prisons, with claimants on a punishing wheel of often futile job search. Now, to be very clear, this is not the fault of job centre staff. Behind this is a performance management regime a set of targets, and a politics. It's how the system is set up. There have been some suicides, officially 69 linked to DWP processing errors, according to the National Audit Office. None of this helps the UK's problems with low productivity and bad jobs. We are disciplining the poor to accept low-paid, precarious work, and in doing so, entrenching these problems. The issue of choice is ideologically loaded. For the neoliberal right, the unemployed are welfare dependent, work shy, and just too picky when it comes to jobs, to be contrasted with hard-working families and the skivers versus the strivers, if you like. An alternative view is offered by Sen's capabilities approach. Now, what Sen argues is that the freedom to choose lives we have reason to value matters for personal well-being. Now, this might include decent work that is freely chosen, but it could also include caring for others, including children, or community activities. So what Sen means by capabilities is not our innate capabilities or skills, but the real choices or opportunities available to us. The choices of the poor are constrained by what he calls conversion factors. Both external circumstances beyond our control, but also the corrosive effects of poverty and deprivation in lowering our expectations. For example, what someone might regard as an acceptable job. We can think of many constraints on the choices of the long-term unemployed and the vulnerable. Some employers may have negative attitudes, seeing them as reluctant to work or forced to apply for jobs by the job centre. Poor schooling, low qualifications, the type and the quality of jobs that are often on offer. So is there a real choice then? Is there a fair choice? The long-term unemployed often have complex needs: domestic abuse, mental health problems, anxiety, physical disability, caring responsibilities, etc. The big stick approach, it just doesn't work for this group. They need personalised support to help them address such needs. Government policy often talks up the need for personalisation as part of its work programmes, which bring in the private and third sector to provide employment support. But in reality, payments by results funding models don't allow this. They end up with providers skewing support towards those who are easiest to move into employment. Those with the most complex needs tend to get parked, or, if you like, forgotten about. So with that, I'll hand over to Peter, who will talk about the research we've been doing in Leicester with third sector organisations.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. What all of that begs, I suppose, is the question, is there a better way? Well, further to evaluating that, we've been looking at two local third sector projects, the GREAT project and the YES project. The GREAT project, or Getting Ready for Employment and Training, is aimed at adults. Conversely, the YES project, or Youth Employment Support Scheme, is aimed at young people not in employment, education or training. It's important to know that these are not government funded. They're part of the Building Better Opportunities programme in England, jointly funded by the National Lottery and the European Social Fund, and the projects are managed by a local charity, Voluntary Action Leicestershire. Significantly, the projects are not based on payment by results or heavily target driven. Both have an avowed mission of putting user needs first. Indeed, users get personalised support from a key worker designed to help them work at their own pace towards their own goals. This could be paid work, educational training, or starting job search. Users also receive help with CVs, interview techniques, sometimes with the help of employers, and get appropriate training. There are also workshops on things like confidence building and managing personal finances. So the research questions that we were interested in at the start of the research were twofold. Firstly, do users feel in control of their choices? And secondly, what impacts do the projects actually have on their lives? And we undertook a qualitative approach here, undertaking interviews with key workers, the participants, and employers. What I want to do in the short time frame we've got here is just give you a feel of the space of the voices of the unemployed adults we spoke to on the GREAT project, the voices of people who all too often are not heard. First of all, what did they have to say about their experience with Job Centre Plus? And what we've got on the left-hand side of the slide here are some very characteristic comments. I felt humiliated. Job Centre Plus is a horrible, horrible experience. Just there to tell you off and penalise you. A quick 10-minute slot, a few questions, and then they tick the boxes. Moving on to the right-hand side of the slide, one user who'd suffered from chronic anxiety spoke about how you had to concentrate on your breathing and try not to panic. Another person added, you just don't feel you want to go. How do they make you feel? You're just a number. And finally, bottom right-hand corner quote here from a single mother who felt she had to justify to her work coach why she had so many children. It was just like, you've got 5 children, you chose to have those children, you've got to get back to work. What comes through ultimately, and I suppose ironically, given that it's Human Rights Day, are feelings of humiliation, of being treated as a non-person, which if you're suffering from depression and panic attacks is really not what you need. No wonder many disengage totally from the whole process. Their experience of the GREAT project couldn't be more different. They felt treated with respect. They had voice. They were in control of their choices, and the support helped them to grow significantly in confidence. Once again, what we've got here are sort of representative sample of quotes from the research that we undertook. Nothing like Job Centre Plus whatsoever. It's all, this is what we can help with. What you get is self-esteem and confidence and belief in yourself, and they are really, really important things. For many of the people that we spoke to, the social aspect of the projects was important. You can talk with other people and somebody will say something and you'll think, yeah, I felt like that. For others, it was about confidence and it was about choice. When I went to the GREAT project, I didn't have no confidence. I didn't have no way of speaking. I was totally down. It slowly started. It took time. Everything is your own choice. They will help you and support you where you want to go. They're not pushing you into anything. And finally, on the bottom here, very friendly and judgmental people that generally wanted to help you. And not one moment did I ever feel judged. Just a few final thoughts here. Clearly, this brief sketch has only really scratched the surface of the research that we've been undertaking. But what we want to emphasize really is that there is a better, more compassionate way than workfare, which is sadly not confined to the UK and is slowly spreading across Europe. We would argue that the third sector has a vital role to play because of its democratic ethos of user-centeredness. But you need funding models that allow personalised support that see the person and start with their needs. Such support, we would suggest, is all too rare. Indeed, projects like the one that we've been talking about could be seen as outliers operating on the margins. An interesting issue, therefore, is could they be scaled up and might they offer an alternative model to mainstream activation policy? We would suggest yes, if the political will is there. These projects, of course, don't and can't solve everything. Employment opportunities are limited, and real choice also depends on policies that address the quality of jobs and also allow those who choose to care for others or do community work perhaps to do so and be properly supported to have a decent life free of poverty. When we talk about choices in welfare policy, we need to keep the spotlight firmly on what right refers to as the choices of the powerful. And we need to care about the human rights of the unemployed and the most vulnerable in our society, the people behind the statistics and the headlines, we would argue, ultimately deserve no less. Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting us today to this really important day and the series of presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Jonathan and Peter. We now have our third speaker, and I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Tim Hilliar, who's the head of Leicester de Montfort Law School, and he's going to talk to us about human rights, rhetoric and reality, the role of responsibility, accountability and truth.
Okay, thanks very much, Julia, and thanks for the other presentations. My presentation is in some ways is sort of at a much more general level, but I think it links in well to what's already been said. These photos on this first slide actually are now 40 years old. It comes as a bit of a shock to me that they're 40 years ago old, because I took them as a researcher. At the time I was working for a human rights organization based in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. And this week, 40 years ago, one of my first jobs, having sort of just flown out to Tel Aviv and traveled to just outside Jerusalem, was to go and photograph these a series of demolished houses. These were houses that were inhabited by Palestinian families. One of the member of the family had been arrested for sort of anti-Israeli activity. So they'd been arrested, they hadn't yet been charged, they certainly hadn't been prosecuted, but in response to the accusations, the Israeli military forces had moved in using laws that had been enacted by the British during the mandatory period in Palestine to impose what amounted to a collective punishment. And this is somebody's house. The people were given a short time in which to gather up their possessions and leave, and then the houses were demolished. A variety of techniques were used. Some were bulldozed, some were demolished using low levels of explosive. The point of showing these photographs really is that these actions were carried out by sort of ordinary Israelis who were by and large undertaking national service at the time. And my sort of main theme throughout this presentation and throughout the research work that I've been doing is that many sort of human rights abuses are committed by ordinary people. And one of the dangers that we need to guard against in sort of a too legalistic approach to human rights and a too much sort of criminalization of human rights abuses is that we focus on sort of a few bad characters and ignore the sort of the systemic influences that lead to the wider abuses. I think I was struck by sort of Omar's introduction and the point that, as this event takes place around the world, countless people are the victims and ongoing victims of human rights abuses. And it's really sort of what can we do effectively to change that situation? So this was the situation 40 years ago. This is sort of how I got into sort of human rights, my first exposure to human rights sort of issues and campaigning for human rights. Two other incidents in history that I wanted to sort of bring to your attention. They're not necessarily that well known. The first is an event from 1864 in Colorado, the end of November in 1864. A massacre took place. The character on the right is Colonel John Chivington, who led the US Army in an attack on the Cheyenne and Arapaho people living in southern Colorado. And a number of villages were attacked and destroyed, and up to 600 people, Native Americans, were killed in this massacre. And the memorial there, you can see, is there today. The point really of identifying this story is, again, that Colonel Chivington was what otherwise would have been said to be a man of good character. He was a Methodist pastor. He had worked for the local community, and the men he commanded had held sort of respectable jobs. They were volunteers, but yet given a particular context, they had carried out this sort of most horrendous, awful crime. A slightly more comparatively recent event occurred in Yosifov in 1942. The character on the right is Colonel Trapp, who led a troop of reserve police officers, German reserve police officers, who carried out a massacre in Poland, a massacre of Jews in Poland. And the reason this particular incident is remembered sort of more widely in the world is it was the subject of a book by Christopher Browning entitled Ordinary Men. And the point that Browning makes is, again, this fact, this massacre was committed by sort of ordinary Germans. They were not, sort of lifelong Nazis. They were people who'd been largely conscripted, reservists. And Browning documents in the book the fact that Colonel Trapp, when issuing the order had come that these massacres were to be carried out and the villages, ethnic cleansing on a wide scale was to be carried out. Trapp unusually had given his men a choice and said, what we've got to do is go into this village and kill people. Not all of you will want to do this, and I fully understand if you don't want to do it, and offered people the choice of not taking part. And in fact, of the troop he commanded, just 12 out of the 500 men took that option and didn't take part. The rest, sort of, however reluctantly, took part. And the point that Browning makes, and it's a point that's then identified by Stanley Milgram in his famous Stanford Prison Experiments, and by Philip Zimbardo in his book on sort of Lucifer and Badness. The point made is that, we all of us like to think in such situation we'd be one of the 12, but in reality, can we say that? We can say that in the comfort of our own homes and offices. Yes, we would definitely be one of the 12. We wouldn't be the majority that carry it out. But in the right context, in the right system, in the right situation, it becomes much more difficult. And my sort of research background has come to look at sort of the role of blame and truth in criminal justice. And one of the points in work I've done with Professor Gavin Dingwall that we try to make is that increasingly society, particularly sort of in Britain, we've turned to a greater use of the criminal law. And one of the effects of that is to increasingly sort of demonize sections of the society without looking at the more systemic reasons why events occur. And this sort of reliance on scapegoating a few can lead to sort of exoneration of the many. And sort of in looking at this issue of human rights and the way in which the sort of the world has developed, I'm struck by the timescales. It's 40 years ago that I was stood just sort of outside Jerusalem photographing those destroyed houses. In fact, 38 years ago, as part of the human rights organization I worked for, I traveled to Geneva to the Human Rights Council for a meeting of NGOs on, in fact, it was to celebrate the 35th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I was there in Geneva on the 10th of December 1983. And you think, well, that was to celebrate 35 years of a declaration that was going to change the world. And now, 38 years later, we're still dealing with the same issues. Now, I was struck by sort of looking at the background of the Universal Declaration itself. And one of the driving forces was a sort of a need to create a new world order, if you like. And looking back, one of the sort of influential texts at the time was this book published by Penguin Special, written by H.G. Wells on the rights of man. And he says in the introduction, at various crises in the history of our communities, it has been our custom to produce a specific declaration of the broad principles on which our public and social life is based, and to abide by that as our fundamental law. And I'm struck by sort of that point, how relevant that continues to be today. The Rights of Man came out of a letter that was written to the Times by Wells and a number of other writers, and it contained the sort of the preliminary draft of what was to become the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was a declaration of broad principles on which public and social life is based. And I think that the first two presentations have sort of showed how relevant that is, the issue both of social life, public life. And it's the principles on which we live, as well as being the fundamental law. And my concern sort of more recently has been that the focus has become much more on ways in which sort of through strong institutions, the reliance can be on criminalization of human rights abuses, rather than emphasizing the need for us all to adopt the broad principles, reinforce those broad principles, and to agree that that's the basis on which we all live our lives. The reference to sort of truth in the title is the extent to which this sort of overemphasis on the sort of the criminal aspects of human rights abuses is to ignore the wider truth of the context in which abuses occur. So to put that up, it's actually a paraphrase, some of you might recognize it, of a famous quote from Tony Blair, initially given in an interview to the New Statesman magazine in 1993, and repeated in a speech to the Labour conference in 1995. And Blair was talking about a new society, a change in society, a move away from what we'd had to a much more optimistic new society. It was another declaration, if you like, of principles of the way in which we live public and social life. Blair talked about the need to be tough on crime. That's absolutely, he emphasized that, but also to be tough on the causes of crime, that crime doesn't occur in social isolation, it occurs in a social and political context. And I think that sometimes is lost in some of the discussion, particularly within sort of legal circles. It's lost in some of the discussion of human rights, that it's not just about identifying individual perpetrators, but it's identifying the wider truth, the context, the wider causes, and the systemic situations that lead to the abuses in the first place. What is it that leads to people like Chivington, people like Trapp, and people like the members of the Israeli Defense Forces carrying out abuses in those situations? So that was my sort of the theme that I wanted to get across, of the need to sort of, for all of us to consider more widely, how we live our lives according to those human rights principles. Thank you.
Much, Tim. So our final speaker is Dr. Amanda Berlan. She's a reader in business and sustainability based in the Leicester Castle Business School. She's talking about something that most people love, which is chocolate. Social justice and equality in cocoa, what every ethical chocolate lover needs to know.
Hi, yes, thank you very much. This is a subject I've been working on for many years now. For over 20 years, I've been looking at the socio-economic sustainability of the chocolate industry. So unfortunately, this is an area where there are lots and lots of challenges and lots of scandals, human rights issues, and for example, deforestation, obesity, marketing to children, child labour, slavery, and all those kind of things. The chocolate sector isn't short of challenges, unfortunately. And it can be very confusing because there are a lot of ethical certification schemes, a lot of organisations making all sorts of claims about their products, and it can be very, very confusing for consumers. Whenever I meet people and I tell them that I work on the sustainability of the chocolate supply chain, they always ask me, well, what chocolate should I be buying? Because I've heard there's child labour, I've heard there are these things going on and I don't feel comfortable with it, but I just don't know what I should be buying. Unfortunately, I won't be able to discuss all the challenges today in the time I have, so I will focus on talking about child labour and about poverty. So unfortunately, when it comes to child labour in cocoa production, the trends are fairly clear. We know, for example, that it's quite common. The most recent big piece of research that was published last year, which was done by the social research organisation NORC, found that 43% of children aged between 5 and 17 in cocoa areas in Ghana and the Ivory Coast are engaged in hazardous work in cocoa. And the Ghana and the Ivory Coast are significant because they're the world's largest producers of cocoa. In addition to knowing that child labour is quite common, we know that it's increasing. So over the course of the last decade, we know that rates have increased, which is very unfortunate because in the course of the last few years, a lot of investments have been made into trying to tackle the problem, but it's clear that there is still a lot of work to be done. What I would caution people about is that this is an issue where there's a lot of misrepresentation and the reporting in the media is not always terribly accurate. So, for example, people often use the terms child labour and slavery interchangeably, but they're very, very clearly very different things. There's reports claiming that cocoa is grown on plantations, which it isn't. It's typically grown on small family-run farms. And, you know, there's a notion that somehow chocolate companies are setting the price that farmers receive. And unfortunately, it is much, much more complicated than that. But if we come back to the fundamental question of what should an ethically minded consumer buy, what should they do? Well, what I would encourage you to do is, unfortunately, I can't give you a list of brands and say, these are perfect, buy this type of chocolate. What I can do is I can tell you to read the wrapper very carefully. So, for example, lots of people, again, in discussions about chocolate, tell me, well, what I do is I buy Tony Chocolonis because I know that then there's no child labour. Actually, if you read the wrapper, that claim is never made. Tony Chocolonis claim they're very ethical. They never claim that they have no child labour. They claim there is no slavery in their supply chain, and they're very clear about that, but they never make the claim that there is no child labour. In fact, last year, they even issued a statement clarifying this, saying, is there illegal child labour in Tony's supply chain? And they say, well, we've never found a case of modern slavery in our supply chain, but we do find instances of illegal child labour occurring on cocoa farms where we source our beans. We've always been 100% transparent about this. We actively look for instances of illegal child labour so we can proactively solve them. They also tell us that they use a child labour monitoring and remediation system, which is in place across the 7 cooperatives that they source their cocoa from. And they tell us very openly that last year they found 387 cases of illegal child labour and remediated 221 of them. So obviously that's encouraging, but what I'd like to draw your attention to is the fact that actually a child labour monitoring and remediation system is also used by many, many other chocolate companies, and this isn't anything particularly special or specific. So again, it's important to kind of go beyond the label and kind of question it and read a bit more and actually find out what other chocolate companies are doing is something really that unique. So then if we get on to farmer poverty, again, it's really interesting because people often say to me, well, the reason why we have child labour is because the farmers are so poor, and the reasons why they're poor is because they're really badly paid by the chocolate industry. And again, unfortunately, this is a very problematic oversimplification of the issues, and actually being able, farmers being able to enjoy greater prosperity isn't so simple. It's very complex. It requires not just higher prices, but increasing farm productivity, some crop diversification to get them through certain periods in the cocoa season, reducing the number of middlemen and all those things, which of course is way beyond what any Western consumer could possibly hope to achieve. So what's that's not to say, though, that the situation, that there's not things that people can do or at least be aware of that can help address this. Again, I would really encourage consumers to read labels carefully if they want to make more informed ethical choices. So how much cocoa does a chocolate product actually contain? Lots of people say to me, well, don't you think it's a disgrace that cocoa farmers work so hard and they only get a small proportion of the value of a chocolate bar? And of course, there are some cases where that is the case and that is wrong and that needs to be addressed. But there are also it's a little bit more complicated. If we look, oh, my arrows have moved, sorry about that. If we look again at our bar of Tony Chocolonis, and sorry, the arrows are no longer pointing to the right things, and I'm not sure why. Anyway, if you look at the ingredients, the main ingredient is sugar, which makes up over 50% of the bar, and the second ingredient is milk. So actually, the amount of cocoa solids in this bar is actually only 32%, which isn't terribly high. And here I'm not targeting Tony Chocolonis in particular. It's very clear that there are a lot of products that we think are chocolatey and therefore contain a lot of cocoa. But if we take the example of Nutella, actually the main ingredients are sugar, palm oil, milk powder, hazelnuts, and actually cocoa only makes up, I think, about 7.5% of the overall jar of Nutella. So, you know, it's important to read the label. Also, because what we can see here is that not only does Nutella not contain very much cocoa, but also it contains a lot of palm oil. And we know that there are a lot of sustainability issues with the production of palm oil. So again, I would very much encourage, when trying to make an ethical choice, I think consumers should look not only to the branding, to the labels on a product, whether it's fair trade or not, but actually just look at the ingredients as well. So is fair trade the answer? Again, this is a question that comes up very often. I'm very often asked to give talks on fair trade and its impact on farmers. And the first thing I'd like to say is that fair trade does offer numerous benefits to farmers. And I'm certainly not seeking to challenge that in any way in today's talk. However, there are some issues that consumers may not necessarily be aware of, which I think are important for people to know about to make more informed choices. So as I said previously, we know that fair trade chocolate is not necessarily free of child labour, as the example of Tony Chocoloni's show. That doesn't mean that it's treated permissively or that the problem's being ignored, but unfortunately, child labour does still happen in spite of companies' best efforts. But it's important to also know that the sort of systems they use are not necessarily exclusive to fair trade, and they're used by many companies across the board. I think it's also important for customers to be aware of the fact that mass balancing exists, and that's something that is typically written in tiny, tiny letters on chocolate products, and most people have probably never heard of mass balancing. To summarize it very, very succinctly, if a company has bought a certain proportion of fair trade beans and non-fair trade beans, and that proportion is reflected in the product, then they're allowed to put the fair trade label on it. So, for example, 10% of their cocoa is fair trade and 90% is conventional, and that proportion is reflected in a particular bar of chocolate, then they're allowed to put the fair trade logo on that bar. And so it means that you can buy a fair trade product, but not 100% of the cocoa beans in that particular product have been bought on fair trade terms. So for people who want their products to be kind of pure and absolutely purchased according to certain terms, that might not sit very comfortably. The question is also about price. There's an assumption made that fair trade farmers are paid more, and that actually is going to enable them to stop using child labour. And unfortunately, again, it's a slightly more complex reality than that. So what I've got there is the graph shows you the blue line is the world market price of cocoa, and as you can see, it's been subject to very many fluctuations in the last 10 years. The orange line shows you the fair trade price of cocoa during that time. And as you can see, it went up drastically, or significantly, I should say, on the 1st of October 2019. But actually, the fair trade price of cocoa has consistently been below the world market price of cocoa on very many occasions. Now, just to be absolutely clear, when the fair trade price of cocoa is lower than the world market price of cocoa, then fair trade farmers receive the world market price. So actually the number of times when they receive a fair trade price is actually really not that high, because most of the time the world market price is higher. So again, this notion that, you know, fair trade farmers are necessarily paid better is very, very problematic, because that's not always the case. They do benefit from a guaranteed minimum price, but what consumers aren't often told is that that minimum price really is quite low. I could, of course, talk about this for many hours and even days, but I'll stop there now. But please, this was only, like I say, a very, very brief introduction, the tip of a big iceberg of issues. So please do feel free to get in touch with me if any of you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. So I'd like to open the floor now to questions from our audience. So you can put your question in the chat, and I will share it with with our presenters. Actually, I have a quick question for Funmi. You know, the projects that you talked about were fascinating. I just would like to know, would you say there is an increasing awareness of the capacity of the arts to articulate injustices and miscarriages of justice? You're on mute. Sorry, Funmi, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you. Could you repeat your question, please?
Yes, I was wondering whether there's a greater awareness of the arts and humanities, books, poetry, the ballet, as you gave that example in your presentation, whether that's becoming more prevalent, where, you know, there's a realization that a novel can kind of, there's a sort of, it nurtures empathy. We can empathize with the position of someone, put ourselves in another's shoes, in relation to something we don't have experience of. Would you say that that's becoming more common? I mean, your research is fascinating because you use, you know, different arts forms to articulate various global problems, particularly on the African continent. Is this something that is becoming more, you know, is there more work in this kind of area being done to highlight global issues and societal problems?
I would say that there is quite a lot of work done in this area, but because it's not done in relation to the concepts of civil society, the public sphere, and the political realm. We might do it within theatre arts or dance studies or within English studies, but and talk about the themes in that suggestion, but we don't look at it in relation to what's happening in the government, amongst voluntary organizations, NGOs, and the whole public sphere. And I feel that the cultural production is actually the culture of the public sphere, if you understand what I mean. And I feel that if it's acknowledged there and discussed there more, it will give opportunity for more voices to be part of the discussion and give people a stronger context for action.
Yes, thank you, Funmi. Would anybody else like to pose a question to any of our speakers on any of the areas discussed? I suppose I have a question for Amanda about Christmas and chocolate, chocolate is a very large part of our culture. It's used to celebrate all sorts of events. Is there something that we're not doing that can, as you say about, the good thing about Tony's chocolate being ethical, but it's not on the wrapper? Is there something either in terms of regulation, legislation, or, that we can put pressure on manufacturers, not just near the farming end of the food chain, the supply chain, but at every part of the food supply chain in chocolate production, make this ethical obligation to produce food that we can feel in good conscience eat without creating human suffering in another part of the world?
Well, I think quite encouragingly, there are lots of changes afoot in terms of new legislation. The EU is looking to make quite a lot of changes and interventions when it comes to child labour in chocolate. I guess I do feel that it's important for consumers to be more aware, but also more careful in the way they consume. So, for example, one of the things I haven't talked about, and actually which isn't talked about very much in the public arena, is the water footprint of chocolate. And actually, it's a product that, in order to grow cocoa, the trees have to be watered, and often most cases they're rain-fed, but not always. And actually, anything we consume has an environmental footprint, like water, energy, or whatever. And the fact that at Christmas we tend to consume chocolate in such huge amounts. And I wonder if actually, you're right that we do need to put pressure on manufacturers to do different things differently and all that. But I think we also need to look at our own consumption habits and ask ourselves if perhaps in a small way we can perhaps scale back a little bit. And I'm not talking about people denying themselves the right to enjoy good chocolate or anything like that. But I think we need sometimes a message of moderation more broadly if we want to achieve some of the goals that were talked about at COP26 and things like that.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, we have time for perhaps another question or two questions. If any of our speakers would like to perhaps even add a little something to their future research plans in relation to the particular topics, that would also be fine. Well, if not, I would like to say, a few final words. We're very, very fortunate to have Mr. Omar Hernández, the UN representative, join us today. It's a real pleasure. And as he said, it's very sad that every day we hear reports about threats to our climate, to our security, to our health. And human rights is, of course, at the centre of all of these and other global problems. So the presentations that we've heard from my colleagues today, those that, are up for discussion, they've shone a spotlight on just some of these issues. But importantly, as with all of the research that we do as academics at Montfort University, they suggest ways in which such problems can be more effectively addressed. And of course, everything we do in our teaching and our research, the end goal is always aligned with the general UN Social Development Goals, which at heart are all about making the world a better place for everyone, to all, without any exception. So I would like to say, finally on this very, very important day, thank you to our speakers, thank you to our UN representative, to our PVC for Sustainability, and especially to our audience. We look forward to sharing this research, the progress on it, and more other areas of research in the future. And of course, we would like to warmly invite you to other such DMU events. So before you go, it's a great pleasure to hand over to our UN representative, who's joining us very early from New York today, Mr. Omar Hernández.
Thank you very much once again, Professor, and once again, my appreciation to the Montfort University and the SDG Hub for Goal 16 for organizing this event, for their various initiatives. And I was very pleased to hear all the different projects that have been undertaken and the different perspectives that have been addressed by the staff and researchers from the EMU regarding human rights. And it is, the UN has a very wide range of international dates and commemorations along the year. And as we are today, on Human Rights Day, it is worth to ask ourselves a question. Do we need to celebrate Human Rights Day? Is there anything to celebrate at all in this particular time? And with opposition, perhaps for some skeptics, I will say that yes, we do have some things to celebrate. We do have things to acknowledge, and there have been great advances over the past few months regarding a number of human rights issues. But I would say confidently that perhaps the most relevant achievement, the most significant milestone that we have with us around the world is that the awareness of human rights has increased indeed. So again, I mentioned, although very briefly during my earlier remarks, the fact that we are all global citizens. And I believe that when we are faced with a global challenge, so there's not this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic is not bound to a specific country or a specific region. It is something that is pretty much present around the world. So it is a global challenge, and that poses global, that demands global solutions. And in that sense, we have seen not only the realization of that fact, also the realization about the importance of multilateralism in order to come together, all nations of the world, regardless of where we stand from the political point of view, and the realization that not only this is a global challenge that is deeply affecting human rights, but also the realization that we are aware of the situation that is pretty much in our very own proximity, in our neighborhood, in our community, but we also are aware of the different human rights violations that are happening around the world. So yes, let us celebrate life. Let us celebrate mankind. But while we are celebrating, we have to actually come together to act, and to act now. We are in the decade of action for the SDGs that was launched by Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, earlier last year, just before the pandemic hit. And we must remember that the time to theorize about SDGs and to theorize on human rights, that time has passed. It is the time now to come together and to care for those who do not have the voice or whose voices are not actually properly heard. It is the time to acknowledge the fact that we have to educate ourselves, to educate others. We have to acknowledge the fact that there are certain things that we need to change, and we need to change it quickly. So there's no time to spend years or decades debating about things that need to be solved right now. People who are starving, people who are living in poverty, people who are being denied access to health, and just I'm going to take just one particular point of view: the vaccines. Well, in many parts of the Western world, we are discussing about the booster shots and the third shots and the prevalence of certain variants of the disease. In many quarters of the world, there are millions of persons who do not have any access whatsoever, not to say one vaccine, but any healthcare facility whatsoever, to which the right to health has been completely denied. So let us think about them when we speak about these human rights. But again, let us celebrate, because human rights are universal, as stated in the declaration itself, and human rights are those rights who make us indeed human. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Mr. Omar Hernández, for joining us and celebrating this important World Human Rights Day together. We look forward to working with you and your colleagues on the UN SDG 16, of which we're so proud, privileged, and excited to be holding again. So thank you to everyone. Stay safe, and let's work to make the world a better place for all. Thank you.